Good afternoon and welcome to today's end-of-year supply chain outlook. I'm Jarrod Ball, Chief Economist of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land. Committed to recognition and reconciliation, we respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. And I, for one, very much hope that we will see more progress on recognition and reconciliation in this term of Federal Parliament. Today, you can join the discussion on Twitter, follow at CEDA_news and join in the discussion using the hashtag supply chains. You can also participate using the Pigeonhole app. You can go directly through the live stream page, or you can log on to ceda.pigeonhole.at and use the passcode supply chains. You can enter in your own questions or view and vote on the questions of others in today's discussion. And as I always say with Pigeonhole, please get in early and often with your questions. I'd also like to acknowledge the sponsors for today's live stream and thank them for their support. That's Accenture and Mackay. We could not do this without you. So the state of supply chains, you'd have to say, has certainly continued to evolve over recent months. Shipping costs have eased from pandemic highs and COVID itself is proving less disruptive. But consumer demand is still high, there is pressure on input costs and natural disasters are crunching supplies and logistics. In addition, we're seeing increased vulnerability to cyber attacks, particularly for manufacturers who are increasingly digitising their operations. So to get to the bottom of these issues and more, I'm joined by Sari Mackay, who is the Managing Director, Strategy and Consulting, Supply Chain and Operations at Accenture, and also Hamish Hansford, who's the Head of the Australian Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre. Each of our speakers is going to make some opening comments, and then we'll get into discussion and Q&A. So as you're listening to them, please jump into the Pigeonhole portal and start to put your questions in. So Sari, we'll start with you. Tell us what you're hearing on the supply chain front from business at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Jarrod, for the introduction. So, as said, I lead the Australia Supply Chain Operations practice here in Australia, New Zealand, and I'm delighted to participate in the live stream event today. Just want to mention before talking about supply chains, I just want to say, Accenture, we're proud CEDA members and recognise their contribution CEDA has been making over 60 years. So for the past few months, we've collaborated, in fact, with CEDA to host a series of industry roundtables, and we listened to practitioners and industry partners in health and life sciences, retail and consumer goods services, and just last month, resources and energy sector in Perth. So in summary, we have natural disasters and, of course, inflation that's been impacting our domestic supply chains over the past 2 years. In fact, floods, for example, are expected to hit the inflation over the next 6 months. There's a Federal Treasury forecast that they'll add about 0.1% in inflation above and beyond all of the global and existing factors in the economy. So we recognise that there is an urgency for organisations to manage these inflationary pressures alongside with minimising supply chain disruptions, addressing strategic costs reduction requirements, and of course, we're satisfying shareholders by addressing ESG commitments. And on the top of that, remaining agile and customer responsive, very tough ask from supply chains of today. What I've heard from the industry attending those roundtables, that the escalating scale of global natural disasters, the geopolitical, economic, environmental challenges, supply chain practitioners particularly see technology playing a key role in future-proofing our Australia's supply chains and building resilience. We also recognise that Australia is at the pivotal point as industries and government focus their efforts on re-evaluating, in fact, globalising supply chains to insulate our country and our manufacturers against future shocks and disruption, and looking at onshore versus offshore options to cushion the impact of supply chain disruptions, as it say. On combination of a local strategic approach and targeted business and government partnership, this could play a key role for us building a future resilience in supply chains in Australia. So on a positive note, I'd just like to point that it is exciting to see that the federal government is investing in areas such as advanced manufacturing, pledging a $1.5 billion commitment to that. If we are bringing supply chains closer to home, it isn't about the flexibility or resiliency and sustainability, but it could also positively impact carbon footprints and creating opportunities for local workforces. Notwithstanding the challenge with cost and inflationary pressure, bringing manufacturing capability home obviously is something that is possible, that has its own challenges as we speak. Thanks, Jarrod.
Thanks for that, Sari. Hamish, the cyber side of this, which we haven't necessarily focused on as much previously on supply chains, what are you seeing out in particularly the threat environment?
Well, thanks, Jarrod, and thanks for Sari for those comments, because I think you're all spot on. We're in an increasingly fragile period of time, stressed supply chains, and I think the discussion that I'm really hearing from industry, from boards, and over the last couple of months with some serious cyber incidents, I think boards are looking at what if that would happen to me? And you're right, Jarrod, cyber has taken on a much bigger dimension, and even today some significant impacts from a cyber event that are happening across the Australian economy. And I think really the discussion that I'd really like to inspire today is, well, what do we do about it? And I really think that the first thing is to demystify cyber. Cyber is just like any other threat. Sure, there are criminal actors, there are state-based adversaries, but when you look at it from a risk perspective, it's just another type of risk. And I think that the challenge is that often people look at cyber and make it much more complex than it is. And I think the big challenge is for chief risk officers, for CISOs, for CIOs, CTOs in companies to really demystify things for boards and to really give boards and CEOs a sense about what's the risk appetite that companies want to have, and how do we start to look at the things that might materially impact the functioning of business, of infrastructure, of the economy more generally. And I think if you break it down there in that way, you can start to work out, well, here are the types of risks that might eventuate, whether that's high-risk vendors or software as a service, and start to look at, well, what if we start to take action, what does that look like? How much can we afford to spend, and what is the risk that we're mitigating? And I really see a change over the last at least a year, but more particularly in the last couple of months, that particularly companies and in the infrastructure space that I look at on a day-to-day basis, people are starting to look at, well, what do we do in terms of maintaining our own perimeter security? But more importantly, who are those suppliers who might materially impact the functioning of our business, and starting to work into contract management, look at external scrutiny of suppliers, and start to build up a good understanding of some of those material risks, particularly in the cyber and supply chain space. So I think that we're on effectively a journey, and one that I think we've got to really take into a generalized risk posture, and to really start to break down what has been a very technical discussion to date. But at the heart of it is risk management and risk decisions, and that's certainly something that we're doing in the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre, particularly in the context of implementation of the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, and with particular reference to the requirement for industry to look at a risk management program at the heart of any cyber issue, at the heart of any supply chain issue, and indeed the heart of any personal or physical security or weather event is risk and risk appetite, and then that flows a whole range of decisions. So I think it's a pretty interesting time in terms of the environment, constantly changing, but also one that's changing in Australian business with a larger focus.
Thanks, Hamish. Well, you've heard initial comments from both of our speakers, so please jump on Pigeonhole and start to get your questions in. But I will start with some questions of my own, and one to begin with for you, Sari. We often talk, we just offhand talk about the digitisation of supply chains, but there's obviously a lot that sits beneath that. How do you see the digitisation of supply chains helping to streamline them? What's the kind of adoption and capability that we see in that space?
Well, if you think about the basic principles that the supply chain digitization is all about ensuring that the different supply chain tools work together to optimize process integration. So bringing the accurate data processes together under one platform that itself provides end-to-end visibility within your supply chain, which itself can streamline your supply chain, given that you have a better understanding of your process end-to-end, and you can actually manage that overall better. So in principle, the whole idea of digitization, digital systems, they can provide business with three critical capabilities: visibility, predictability, and flexibility. So if you're thinking a resilient supply chain is built on flexible cloud-based technology, it can mitigate your effects on, as an example, of those supply chain disruptions we spoke about. So if we think about when we speak to clients about their business challenges, they often mention slow processes that of data or untimely data or lack of functional optimization and inability to connect with their external parties like suppliers and customers. So basically that can lead to loss of revenue or service issues, as an example. But again, looking at how to solve this is basically with digital technology and capability, you can go from reacting on issues to sensing and really enabling you to participate. So if I'm looking at the supply chain just referring to supply chain sessions we hosted with CEDA on those roundtables, it did become evident that investment in digital technology is going to increase across the industry and across all of the industries in Australia. So the indicator for this is that the disruptions, as an example, are going to continue. The cost pressures are continuing. So there are ways digitization will give you an opportunity to help manage your end-to-end, streamline your supply chain, as well as manage those disruptions better. In terms of digital capability, like I said, about being able to sense ahead of time, and that actually enables you to plan appropriate course of action earlier as they occur. So if you think about, in addition of that connectivity across your data flows in your supply chain with digitization, it could also, in fact, improve the supply chain's normal business as usual operations. Again, coming back to that end-to-end visibility, and also able to have a massive amount of data analytics and hopefully share it with your customers, suppliers, and trade partners and other key stakeholders. And if you think about that itself, it should be leading to improving your end-to-end supply chain improvement. So if I'm thinking in summary of this streamlining concept, so if you can sense your demand changes, as an example, better, you get that demand information flow straight into how you plan your supply to meet that demand earlier, and that anticipatively can react to that. Inevitably, you can actually have a better inventory levels, and you can do your whole of end-to-end supply chain process much more streamlined and efficient way. And in fact, you might also have some cost savings as a consequence of that.
Thanks, Sari. And maybe just one follow-up question to that. Are there particular sectors that you are seeing who are doing this well, or perhaps are more mature than others?
Well, I'm just seeing the fast-moving consumer goods. Traditionally, consumer products companies are ahead of the game, as well as retailers. This saying, though, we have some fantastic through Accenture work across different types of industries. But I guess in terms of looking at European industries being ahead, as well as in Australia, we have our retailers and FMCG companies who supply those retailers are very much building those capabilities, have been building those capabilities overall.
Thanks, Sari. Hamish, so obviously digitisation presents a massive opportunity, but also there are some practical challenges to overcome, and Sari's touched on the issue of connectivity. People often at that point come to what role for government around standardisation. Do you see any kind of logical role for government in terms of coordination or regulation setting in terms of getting that kind of digitisation and connection across different parts of supply chains moving faster?
Definitely, Jarrod, and I think government conceptually steps in where the market fails or there's a particular area of requirement in the market, particularly in relation to potentially vulnerable Australians or vulnerable citizens. And I think digitisation fundamentally transforms economies and businesses. But I think that the general premise is that people don't understand how technology works, including in business. And so whilst we may be really avid users of technology and everyone's online today, fundamentally, it's a rare number of people then who fundamentally understand how technology operates. And I think it's that area that the government plays a role in creating standards, looking at where you might set the level playing field so that everyone can cooperate, particularly from my perspective in looking at the security and the downside of digital agendas and digital technology. And I think a really great example is when you look in the healthcare sector, a sector that's full of Internet of Things devices, full of a whole range of technology that's generally disaggregated. And actually, when you look at cyber security, you often look at perimeter security. But if you have a hospital, for example, or a general practice that has a whole range of machines connected to different parts of the world, you start to think actually the risk exposure has exponentially increased. And so actually thinking about Internet of Things devices and putting standards around those and making it really transparent for people who buy technology, looking at people, the aftercare support, including things like patches and software updates, and then looking at whether or not we should be setting a maturity level for businesses more generally to meet for their own security. I think they're all the issues that really government should play a role in terms of thinking about the digital economy. And the reason why the government should play a role is if you don't do things, people will often intuitively go for the cheapest product with the most functionality. And then you end up into a period where actually you may well create a much more insecure society that's prone to things like data leaks and sensitive leaks of healthcare information and private information. Or you might actually find that infrastructure stops working at its most catastrophic era. So I really think that government has a strong security function and a strong standards function, both from a security but also from a safety perspective. And that's something that I think can only be done in collaboration with industry and really coming up with those common standards. But there is a strong role there for government and governments.
And I guess just to follow on from that, Hamish, that role for industry, as industry increasingly digitise their supply chains, what is it that you want to see them doing around as you put it, the broader kind of risk issues and addressing some of those risks, and particularly, I guess, for different sizes of business, how they should be thinking about those risks and addressing them?
Sure. I think there's three roles for industry. The first area is really around global standards, and having Australian businesses involved in global standard setting isn't something that we routinely see. So actually, there's a role there for both government and industry to shape the global standards. So I think that's the first particular area. The second one, I think, really is a responsibility for larger businesses to play a contributing role to the uplift of different sectors, whether or not that's the health sector, the education sector, utilities, energy providers, transport, financial institutions, actually lifting the whole of an industry actually helps Australia to become a much harder target. And I think there is effectively a moral obligation on those larger companies to help lift their industry standards more generally. And then I think the final obligation is a really one that is a culture. So a culture of curiosity from everyone involved in running business in Australia, running government agencies, running infrastructure. And actually the best outcome that I see and the really good examples of what good looks like is a curious executive in an agency, both in the government but also in the private sector, who are asking the right questions, who are curious to learn around what risk means and where the risks might lie, and then consequently, how do you invest for the long term, and how do you create the most prosperous company that you can, noting that actually security by design and security up front and protecting supply chains, having a strong foundational cybersecurity platform really does set anyone up for success in the long term. I think it does come with cost, but the cost benefit really has to be part of the decision in any business and part of the upfront consideration for those who I look at and think are the most successful in the economy.
Thanks, Hamish. Sari, this issue, I guess, of digitisation does present greater opportunities for a lot more collaboration across industries, and we're often intensely focused on competition, and that's obviously a good thing for consumers. But what are the opportunities here in terms of getting a little bit more collaboration and, I guess, seamless sort of movement across different parts of the supply chain?
So one way to ask that, does digitization actually provide the opportunity and platform for collaborating in, let's say, in supply issues or supply chains in general? Short answer is yes. So by virtue of ability to access the data and it's shared across the network, so digitization enabled improved real-time data, better quality sharing ability, and I said before, allowing you to plan, connect earlier and faster with your supply chain partners. So in principle, if you think of virtue of that network of digital network of your parties within and the systems and the data flowing, so you can collaborate in principle technically with multiple parties across the organization within different functions internally as well as externally with suppliers and customers, and also with, as an example, ecosystem partners being a technology providers. So you can consequently have better planning, better forecasting. I mentioned inventory management and resource planning. And again, if you think about that inflationary pressure I spoke about before, it can help you to manage your costs better as a consequence of better planning, in example. If you think about the recent balance gate, and I'm just going to throw out an idea there. So we had if we would have had a pallet shortages due to timber shortages post bushfire season, which actually has been still ongoing in 2022. If you're looking at using digital as creative collaboration, so imagine if we have a digital label, or it could be a label of a product such as pallets, and you would actually be able to have an industry-wide sort of system of tracking those pallets and digitize the supply chain of pallets. As an example, obviously this would require collaboration across the suppliers of pallets and people within the retail and suppliers, as well as the technology solution on those sort of intelligent pallets which you could track through the supply chain. But certainly, if you think about managing and collaboratively have an industry solution such as pallet gate, as the industry saw last year, and it's still ongoing, could be an example where digitization could allow for creative collaboration on issues within supply chain in Australia.
Well, I absolutely think that we would like to see more collaboration on the supply of pallets. That's for sure. And perhaps this is a good follow-on question for you, Sari. I'm just looking at the Pigeonhole questions. There are a couple. It would be nice to see a few more in there. So please jump in there and ask some more questions. But we do have one from Anonymous getting to, I guess, the critical imminent issues before us. Sari, with Christmas coming, are presents going to arrive in time, or will celebrations be ruined? We have seen some reports today, I think, in the media around Woolworths expressing some caution around some of the kind of favourite produce and things that we usually see in the supermarkets at Christmas. What should our expectations be over the next sort of 6 to 7 weeks?
Well, what I'm also hearing, Jarrod, to that concern about the supply to Christmas is that there's been actually an ongoing demand and earlier demand for Christmas, I guess, deliveries or ongoing supply chain execution earlier in the season. That itself hasn't obviously solved all the anticipated key peak period, as we speak in the industry terms, and supply chain practitioners before Christmas. So I guess it comes back to managing across the end-to-end supply chain. So that Woolies article you're mentioning, I unfortunately haven't seen that yet, but I'm now concerned that I have to certainly follow up on what's going on there. But in terms of all in all of the companies who are part of the whole of the key peak period of Christmas, a lot of those companies, when they have had their domestic supply chains, I would like to think that they've had a very controlled, good strategic planning process in place to enable them to be delivering to those Christmas demands and Christmas all the way to consumer demand products to our retailers as we speak, and or to e-commerce platforms. When it comes to international supply chain, that has been an issue and still is. But again, what I've seen in another industry coming from the industry is that those safety stocks have been built over time. There's been a lot of experience being gathered during COVID across the industry. So I'm rather confident that we'll still make the Christmas presents to our children and our families and close ones. However, any specific issues and risks as they come again, going back to the collaboration and technology capability, I guess those companies who are better prepared with their digital technology, as an example, they can probably have the greater visibility as those issues occur and respond quite quickly to those disruptions as they occur as well. So those companies are prepared with their supply chains, good technology platforms and collaboration suppliers. They'll be okay. Those who haven't actually done those earlier work is probably going to be struggling either supplying their customers or supplying to consumers as we speak.
Thanks, Sari. We are getting a few more questions in Pigeonhole, but continue to encourage people to jump in and ask some more questions. Hamish, I want to come to you again. You've talked a lot about the kind of risk and threats and the kind of protective actions, I guess, that business and others can take. We've obviously seen that cyber incidents are going to happen. That's been painfully realised in the last couple of months. So when we're thinking about this in a supply chain context, when it does happen, what's your sort of advice for businesses who, both in terms of victims, but also in indirect kind of impacted businesses? What should be some of the first things on businesses' mind in responding to something when it does happen?
Well, I think when you think about what good looks like, a business would already have war-gamed a scenario and come to the realisation that actually we've practiced this many times before. We see that in really good businesses, ones that are well prepared, but it's not ubiquitous. So I think prevention's the very first thing. And that gets you to the place where during an incident, there's two particular issues that really need to be dealt with. First of all, management of the specific cyber incident. So fixing the technical issues, making sure that a actor isn't in your network anymore, making sure the vulnerability has been fixed, I think is the most immediate issue. And then I think that the area that really people struggle with is what's the ongoing consequence management, and it will change over time. And so I think the very first thing that people should do is think about communications, both within different businesses, to customers, to those who might have been impacted by a cyber incident, and be really genuine and truthful around what you know and what you don't know. And really thinking about that, what you know on day one will not be the same in the future. Any cyber incident, regardless of who the actor is, will potentially change over time. And thinking about someone who's accessed your network and either exfiltrated data or had a ransomware attack to lock up data or a particular network, what you know might say, here's what we know on day one, and we expect to change over time, and keep that constant feed up, particularly to those impacted Australian businesses and customers more generally. And then I think moving on from that, really looking at, well, actually, if we were subject to a cyber attack, and if the worst happened, and what might that look like? But then what types of services do we start to think about? And I really think the consequence management of any cyber incident is the era of really thinking more generally around what do we need to do as a business to protect our customers and then the flow-on implications. And I think the most recent incidents that have occurred, really thinking about the quantum of Australians impacted, and then the flow-on services that might need to be provided, whether that's the reissuing of credentials, identity management and ongoing monitoring of identity for fraud purposes, or more specialised care. And even today, for example, the government's announced a number of services in partnership with Medibank, for example, really thinking about vulnerable Australians, including support from Services Australia. So I think it's a much more holistic look at what an incident might do for a particular technical solution, but then a much bigger question around the ongoing consequences that I think many companies are looking at the cyber incidents around the world, not just in Australia. And I think Colonial Pipeline is a great example about what a really impactful cyber incident can really then have a consequential impact on the provision, in that case, of essential liquid fuels, but actually thinking about what are the flow-on consequences that an individual business might have on the economy or generally. And I know that's a really difficult thing to look at, but I think it's an essential part of running a business in today's society.
Thanks for that, Hamish. All right, I did have some questions on modern slavery and ESG, which have also come up in Pigeonhole. So I might just combine those two questions. Sari, starting with you around the impact of increased regulation that we're seeing on supply chains, obviously around modern slavery, but also an increased focus on ESG and the SDG goals. How do you see that impacting on companies? And perhaps the question that's in Pigeonhole is around sort of how digitisation might help with some of that as well. So if you're able to comment on that too, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, no worries. So if you think about this, is a very timely question given we have the COP27 in Egypt this week. I guess whilst the outcomes are unclear in terms of the impact, in terms of the actual regulatory environment, it's not going to change, but there's some obviously future kind of messaging coming through to us when it comes to our ESG and our environmental goals. I think that's something that we'll look out for. But I guess if you think about overall the Sustainable Development Goals and ESG, so I guess by now that should be well understood in most companies in Australia, and having a roadmap to address some of the reduction goals, as an example, in carbon and targets across the environmental, social impact of your supply chain. So I guess when it comes to supply chain itself, you have three kind of layers on the SDG, looking at being trusted, looking having net zero usually, and then having a look at how you can have a circular economy to drive resources and your products throughout your on your return on within your supply chain. So if you're looking at that and thinking of the actual where we are now, is that an example where supply chain actually has an impact, and why it's important to have the regulation and the actual targets for us is that it actually contributes about 60% of carbon emissions, as an example, in the world. This is why we should have a great attention to looking at within the business of how you measure and manage the ongoing impact of your business in the environment, not just on the community you service. So furthermore, if you're thinking regulation, so regulation obviously creates minimum standards. Those standards are not only for your government and your regulatory bodies, but also your stakeholders such as shareholders, community and employees. They all expect companies to take actions and meet these standards. So given that supply chain has an impact on the environment and that regulation creates minimum standard, so clear importance if they're that. And now we have an example coming up, the carbon reduction, so we will have legislated targets. So minimum standard requires that you need to create an accurate set of data, have an accurate or reliable source of that data so that you can create reporting on your current state impact, as well as when you are declaring that impact, being carbon as an example for Scope 1 and 2 as a minimum, you'll be able to show a reliable picture of your impact on the environment. And I guess that's something that I think we want to make sure that if you're thinking about the attention on the ESG and impact on supply chain, is number one in basics, understand what your footprint is and what impact do you have, and keep reporting on it and setting up those targets. If you then think about the impact further and think about the companies and supply chains, so in principle, how you're going to get to that is either having a good digital technology layer and have a good access to data, and actually having good visibility of your suppliers, coming back to your digital question. So if you are able to set up a digital, good digital technology layer, as well as you can connect with your suppliers, you're more likely getting and actually also understanding, started to collect a data around your scope 3, for instance, for your carbon footprint. And if you think about the furthermore impact is, if you don't have the technology, the impact on actually increased regulatory compliance is that you have to have someone physically putting up databases and Excel spreadsheets to actually be able to start reporting some of those metrics as you have to go. And I guess if you think about, you have to be measure accurately, you need specific skills and talent to focus on managing the data, reporting, and building the roadmap to articulate and comments, for instance, those environmental sustainable targets and let's say in the carbon that reduction plan. And I guess if I'm thinking about that SOL, just want to say that the SOL digital technology can help. It offers the way, actually, there's an example, to chart your emissions. It could map out your suppliers. It could track their record. It could actually building all of the roadmap to tackle those issues. So if you're thinking some of the tools we're seeing where you can actually map full your suppliers, and in fact, having a risk score against your suppliers. So we have tools like that in the digital world now that you can actually see accurate risk profile of your supplier, for instance, against ESG. So that's possible now even, and then you can actually start building your mitigation plans and or collaborating with your suppliers, how you're going to meet, for instance, reduction targets, what you're getting. I'm just looking at from the inbound perspective. When it comes to customers, let's say you're a supplier to a major retailer, obviously there's a calling from your customers to do something, and your supply chains need to work and collaborate together with your customers to not only provide them the scope and the carbon footprint, provide them the scope 3 picture, but also to actually go plan together and collaborate how you're going to actually have a lower emissions, better water, more water reduction, better packaging, and so forth, whatever you decide on as the environmental sustainable impact. In terms of the modern slavery, I think coming back to that, I think, Hamish, you are the resident subject matter expert. So I'd like to throw back to Jarrod, to you, and back to Hamish, perhaps, to cover the modern slavery.
Thanks, Sari, and no pressure, Hamish. You've been outed as an expert on this. What's your take?
Well, I certainly helped the former government introduce the Modern Slavery Act in 2018, and I think the really difficult fact that we all have to confront is there are still people living in slavery today, and the clothes that we wear, the products that we use involve those who in the supply chain and the provision of those products and goods really involve people working and living in modern slavery. And for a country like Australia, the governments, plural, have taken the view that that's unacceptable. And I think when you look at that situation, and having spoken to people who have lived in modern slavery-like conditions, including in Australia, the development of legislation really does give a signal, and Sari's mentioned the case in the environmental world, but the same is true in what is the people who profit on the misery of other people. And really, it really gives you a really human perspective. That the best way we thought to flesh out what people are doing on modern slavery isn't by issuing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fines in a new regulatory system, but really building transparency. And so for the first time in the history of the world, Australia has developed a register where people can provide their modern slavery statements, really looking at their own supply chain for those businesses with $100 million or more revenue per year, and really to get the sense that between different companies, you get a sense about what others are doing to flesh out that transparency and to have the market form the behaviour that Australian industry would really set the benchmark for each other. But then for customers and consumers, either those businesses looking into their own supply chain and looking for how they might purchase goods or supplies, but then for the everyday customer to really look at, or the more inquisitorial customers, I guess, really looking at what companies are doing and whether or not that's good enough. And I think we've seen examples in the press about where companies have failed to look at the risk of modern slavery and then the consequential impact to their own revenue and their own market share, and that's a negative impact, obviously. But I really think that as a moral issue, Australia is now legislated for modern slavery, but so are jurisdictions across the world, most notably, I think, the United Kingdom, but also individual jurisdictions like California. So I think it's a period of change, but there is a moral imperative there from a human perspective.
Thanks, Hamish. And I guess both on the modern slavery perspective, but also on the cyber perspective, clearly Australia can't do all this alone. What are you seeing in terms of international coordination, and have we got this right at the moment in terms of some of the multilateral and bilateral institutions? And is there more that we can do?
I think definitely more that we can do. I speak to particularly multinational companies who try to operate across multiple jurisdictions, and I think the end result that some implications of regulation has is people put a lot of effort into compliance. And when you think that through, actually having lots of compliance checklists and having people going out with clipboards or, I suppose, modern iPads now and really looking at checklists isn't getting you a security or a safety outcome or a protection of modern slavery or an environmental outcome. So I think it is incumbent on regulators across the world to think about regulation much more on a global perspective, particularly think about who operates in individual jurisdictions, how regulation is more principles-based and more able to be operationalised internationally. And I think a really great example of that is when it comes to cybersecurity, Australia has certain standards and we have international standards as well. And I think regardless of the standard that people seek to use, whether or not that's the Essential 8 Maturity Model out of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre or the NIST framework or ISO 27001, it doesn't really matter if you bring the perspective of we want a security outcome and a cybersecurity outcome. If you use a particular standard that's globally recognised in an individual jurisdiction or globally, and that makes it easier for companies to administer their business, I think we should more and more be focused on outcomes and security outcomes and principle-based regulation, and really think that's a challenge for governments across the world.
Thanks, Hamish. That's a nice kind of entry into my next question, which kind of combining a couple of questions in Pigeonhole around policy and the role of policy. And, you know, there's a specific question around what state governments can do to support the efficiency of supply chains. And obviously we saw some changes to things like truck curfews during COVID-19 and other kind of regulatory arrangements, but also more broadly, people asking here about what the biggest kind of policy challenges are. Sari, I might start with you in terms of if there was just one kind of area of policy that you could have an impact on that might help the efficiency of supply chains at any level of government. Is there anything that comes to mind from your perspective or things that business say to you?
Well, one thing is around, like, I guess overall, if you have a standardized approach, coming back to freight, for instance, we get standardized. I take two lenses: is the freight, and then I'm going back to the digital discussion we had before and collaborations. So if you think about it, we would have a common standards when it comes to, let's say, for instance, in the freight industry or in let's say mass management, or how we actually manage safety across. We have different, I would say, regulatory requirements across different states. As an example, in freight. I'm just thinking of mass management as an example, a classic one from the past that actually managing the grain supply chain. So that's an example where more and more standardization across states when it comes to like this sort of regulatory environment or limits when it's come to operating your business within the freight industry would be great. A national federal approach into the regulation. So second point there is the actual collaboration digital. So what I'm discussing with actually practitioners and the industry is the fact that if we are getting all of this digital capability and we are having more data that we can share and actually collaborate more across the industries, one can then ask of more leniency, particularly if there is an issue of natural disaster impacting on, let's say, I'm not sure whether this is possible. Let's say we're going back to mining and resourcing, which are the cornerstone of our industry in Australia when it comes to our export. So I'm thinking digital capability and ability to actually collaborate more with the larger companies or with the smaller, larger, medium, doesn't matter, with the suppliers as well as the actual participants in that supply chain, being it port capacity planning, being it anything. So if there's actually ability to be more flexible, how companies can, in general, collaborate without having, an issue with various constraints with pollution and so forth. I guess that's something that needs to be defined of what good looks like when it comes to having a different way of working through digital capability, and how does the industry actually work and collaborate better and actually still be very clear and able to be on white and black rather than the grey world where they're not sure whether they can actually and what they can do given the new technology capability we have. So that's actually in terms of policy thinking of clarity of those frameworks, I think would be useful. That's my call up.
Thanks, Sari. Hamish?
Well, I think you triggered me, Jarrod, with supply chains during COVID, because we're bringing local councils to try and break through the local noise restrictions to try and get essential food and goods to Australians during the middle of the pandemic, trying to get essential workers to cross state borders that were shut, really is an example about where regulation hinders otherwise good activity. And I think if you're asking for one particular change, I really think people should be open at all levels of government and all levels of regulation to mutual recognition of other laws and other regulations where things might be done for a particular purpose. But having companies redo things or individuals redo things just because there's a cottage industry of regulation or just because it's slightly different, I really think is hampering our economic productivity and really reducing the amount of time we collectively as a society can spend on things like thinking about security and safety, thinking about things like the environment and protecting modern slavery. How do we start to create an environment where we can mutually recognise regulations? And I think when you think through the agenda for today and the topics that we've been talking about, how do we create a more digital agenda that can help with those outcomes? And I think when you think about state and territory governments, Commonwealth government, local governments, that's a big challenge for all of us. And it's a big challenge, particularly coming from a regulator, to try and think about things from someone else's perspective and have a reliance on them rather than doing everything yourself.
Thanks, Hamish. Good call out on mutual recognition. We do have some more questions in Pigeonhole, which I'd like to get to in the time that we have left. One question, I think we've partially answered this today, but it's worth asking explicitly. Do you think that the issues we have seen in supply chains over COVID will right themselves in coming years, or do businesses and government need to operate differently to fix the problems? And I think we're certainly hearing today in terms of digitisation and other factors that we're already seeing a change. But it is an interesting question because we always, and certainly in a number of areas, we've talked about COVID as being the shock that will change the way that we do business or change people's behaviour. Sari, do you agree with the premise that actually we're already changing fundamentally the way that people conduct their supply chain activities, and perhaps it's not just COVID, but also some of the things that we've seen in the aftermath in terms of natural disasters, inflation, that the old business as usual just doesn't cut it anymore?
I couldn't agree more with the fact that the old business doesn't cut it anymore. So we call it the new normal. And from again, coming from the supply chain perspective, I think there's a different types of crystal all predictions when things go much better. But the better isn't actually something that we can clearly define. So 2024 June, I've seen somewhere, and end of 2023, it's all good. It just depends on which sources one reads. So either way, these disruptions will continue. So we call them new normal, and we just need to be ready for actually be more within the supply chain. Coming back to that comment around the digital technology, to actually have a more resilient supply chain. So ability to actually anticipate, cushion your supply chain as those issues occur, as well as then have actually ready to go action plans to actually mitigate those risks. So the old way of building inventory is no longer. You can actually, with current digital tools, as an example, you can assess your risk profile as a business nowadays. You can actually have a total visibility and gain insights of your supply chain end to end through your suppliers, and actually even virtually make a digital supply chain called the digital twin to actually model how do you respond to those issues as they occur in the future. And then finally, you can even do a stress test within your supply chain to actually, there's an MIT stress test as an example. You can actually see how responsive are you, and how would you respond to a particular supplier failing, to particular, international freight issue occurring in your supply chain and so forth. So the old way of business no longer. I think there's going to be a new normal, and the new normal requires us to be more creative, more collaborative, and actually look for technology solutions, as well as the foundational people and process capabilities to actually respond and mitigate those issues as they come along.
And Sari, in your opening comments, you touched on the issue of some level of onshoring, but there's a set of challenges around that. And of course, at the onset of the pandemic, I think there was a lot of perhaps, over-exaggerated discussion of onshoring. And what we've seen, I think, has been a bit more of a nuanced approach around, diversity of offshore suppliers and some onshoring where it makes sense. How do you see that kind of area evolving post-COVID?
So I think the post-COVID itself, there's actually coming back to these natural disasters, geopolitical uncertainties with Ukraine, overall the situation in China and everything. So all of that has required all of the supply chain practitioners certainly to assess and reassess of what kind of strategic sourcing plan do you have for your business. So that could mean that you are certainly onshoring that capability in the market, or a market like Australia. We talked about the actual investment on advanced manufacturing. I think in summary, so when you are sitting in the business as a chief supply chain officer, you have few options to consider. You can think about, first and foremost, understand that supply network and the risk profile. So if you diagnose that, you can then look at, I'm going to have another supplier or several suppliers to support if an offshore manufacturing plant can't manufacture. This question around onshoring, it's not the silver bullet to my mind. It's actually to look at holistically across all of your supply network, because you could have nearshoring, which means that you have a country like, I don't know, somewhere in Southeast Asia or New Zealand, which could be much more cost efficient and palatable, a mitigation to your potential risks as they occur within your supply chain. So there are offshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, onshoring. There are quite a number of topics being discussed at the moment. And I think all of those options will have pros and cons. And as a supply chain practitioner and businesses and boards will have a look at first that risk profile. And then I think it's a matter of building that plan, what suits to their various businesses and the risk profile and the cost of failure there is to mitigate for.
Thanks, Sari. And Hamish, obviously, COVID has seen a lot greater volume of digital transactions and supply chain activities, which has increased the cyber threat. So I'm perhaps verbling you here a bit. I'm guessing that life is never going to return to what it was pre-COVID in terms of that cyber threat level and the level of vigilance and protection that people need to have in mind.
I don't think so. And I think that the concept of just in time has just been blown out of the water. And the idea that COVID-19 was a black swan event, I also think has become much more in terms of business and customers, much more in terms of regular events that might happen, from fires to pandemics. And I think that's the future. And when you look globally about the stability of our global system, it's never been a much more tense time, I don't think, in the history of the world, arguably. And I think that's going to continue, from everything from supply chain issues to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Whole range of issues make supply chains particularly stressed, and something that I think we're going to continue on with for some time. And maybe just to circle back to one of your previous questions about the period traditionally known as Christmas, I think you're right. It's going to be a period of prior preparation and planning to make sure that presents arrive in time. But there's no guarantees in life.
Hamish, you brought us to the kind of unpredictability and uncertainty and volatility in the current world. I'm almost not sure that we want to end there, but we probably have to. Thank you both for contributing your insights to today's discussion. I think to Hamish's point about Christmas, I think it's going to be interesting, not just what happens over the next 8 weeks, but what we see in 2023. And the extent to which we continue to see changes in supply chains, but also in that external environment and the kind of macroeconomic environment that we have contributing to the behaviour of companies, and also what we see in terms of consumer demand as interest rates continue to increase. I would like to thank all of you in the audience for participating today as well, and of course our sponsors once again, Accenture and Maddix. Please take a moment to rate the experience of the event in Pigeonhole. And also please keep an eye out for an event email afterwards that will include a link to today's live stream recording. And finally, as I always do, would like to remind you to keep an eye on CEDA.com.au, where you can register for a number of our different events, including our conference that will be coming up on the supply chain outlook on Tuesday, the 4th of April, 2023. So putting to the test, how far things will evolve in the next 5 months in supply chains from the conversation here. It will be interesting to look back and reflect on that as part of that conference. So without any further ado, thanks everyone for joining today's live stream, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.